Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Prudent Observations. We are finally live, and we're going to have a lovely discussion on the history of American foreign policy, making understanding of what Biden said, that Islam was woven into the heart of American culture from the start. Despite him being pandering, I like to think that he was referring to our wars with the Barbary States in the early history of the American Republic. And today I am joined by none other than Mr. Christopher Sandbatch, one of my favorite people to talk to about U.S. history. How are you, sir?
Did you forcibly unmute me?
I sure did.
It's great to be here. I'm also glad to see that my fifth column is rolling deep in the chat already. Let's see, what sort of names did I get called? Infuriating, dingbat, compelling, all sometimes from the same people. It's good to be here.
Well, I'm glad that you're here. So I figured that why not have a brief respite from what on earth is going on in the world and go a little bit back in time about the idea of American foreign policy with respects to Middle Eastern cultures. Because this is, as we take a look at the ongoing dispute between Iran and Afghanistan and a lot of the Taliban having U.S. arms, I can't help but think about the fact that this isn't our first merry-go-round with Islamic and Middle Eastern cultures. And one of the earliest, of course, parts of American foreign policy, despite our desires to not be particularly involved in the affairs of the old world, was that America's independence, of course, meant that we were an independent nation. We were first recognized by the Sultanate, the independent Sultanate of Morocco, in the mid 1780s. And from there, we had also been broken free from any legal and jurisdictional treaties that had existed with our relationship to respects to the Mediterranean Sea. So it meant that American sailors, merchants, and goods were likely to be seized by what were known as the Barbary States. Now, it's sort of what you might also call like the Tripolitania, but they were, of course, you had the North African Ottoman provinces of the Ottoman Empire, particularly Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. Quasi-independent, they did sort of answer to the Ottoman Empire, but they definitely had conducted their own policy and their own means in which to conduct trade as well as piracy. So sometimes you'll hear Barbary pirates, other times you will hear Barbary corsairs, if you take a look at the historical literature. And we're going to take a look at the history of not only those states, the history of European slavery by not only those states, but also just sort of the greater European Barbary pirates from the 16th to the 19th centuries. And then the American government working in coordination with Sweden and Sicily to sort of take care of this problem from 1801 to 1805. So why not talk about Thomas Jefferson and some other great American folk heroes of the time?
Yeah, my head is exploding from all of the K lines that you've lit up in two minutes of talking. It's like we got one of the things I think is real interesting here, and this is like because this is also a rare example of a topic that we can really kind of talk about without any kind of preconceived notion or prejudice, because it's so damn it complicates what you call the boomer truth regime or whatever so badly to even mention that these things happened, that this stuff just gets skipped over. So, I mean, I'm not sure what public schools say, like public school programs, and even really what undergraduate programs say about the Barbary Coast Wars, but I bet it's not much.
It was like a passing paragraph in my high school history textbook that we went to war with the Barbary States, creation of the United States Marine Corps, and then that's it.
So there are a couple of things that I want to, just point out real quick, the themes that I'll probably hit on over and over, of course, the rest of the show. One of them is, I think a lot of your viewers, because I know a lot of the Twitter bros that that I encounter through what is that character's name? That that Balkan character that I have like a terrible frenemy relationship with. He's gone now. Carlsbad, yeah. Nigel Carlsbad and his like sort of fandom following on Twitter. They do a lot of good work forwarding the historical inquiry of a German historian by the name of Reinhard Koselleck. And I used him in my graduate thesis extensively, and I always mispronounce his name, so that may not be right. And this is a kind of a framework that is laid over this field that we will tend to want to call Atlantic studies and then world system studies more broadly. But Koselleck in particular looks at this world that is, emerging at the end of the 18th century, and the German word he uses for it is Sattelzeit, or he uses a couple different words. One of them means saddle time, that's Sattelzeit, and then Schwellenzeit, which means like transition time. And this is a really fascinating period in world history because we tend to want to think of the 19th century, or all of the, as soon as the Industrial Revolution happens, we're going to tend to want to think about all world diplomacy being like nation states interacting. And even if we can get past that not being the case in the Atlantic basin and in what we think of as the old world, we still tend to want to think of all diplomacy that's occurring is between nation states. And that's not the case here. This is, like the Sattelzeit refers to this kind of period of time whenever the modern world is coming into existence, and it does so slowly, at first in France and England and in the Low Countries, and then it, it sort of radiates outward from there. But one of the things that's really interesting to deal with is that we have, in this instance, we have almost entirely not entirely because Sweden is involved and so is Sicily, but we have these post-absolutist states that are dealing with one another. So this is like in the Precambrian explosion of modernity, a lot of different political economies were viable in ways that they aren't now, as the Sattelzeit ends. So like there are the ancient, still existing absolutist empires. There are some city-states that are, city-states type structures that are still in existence. Another one of these weird political economies is this kind of semi-autonomous satrapy of this like collapsing Ottoman civilization that are way more tribally inflected and theocratically inflected. And then, of course, there's the political economy that is going to be, end up being the winner of the next 2 centuries, which is the United States Representative Republic. And it's like really making, we say this every time I do a stream, but like, we've kind of done 3 streams now that hit on the same themes. This is very early on, very America really starting to take on its first international role here. And, the internal politics of exactly what position that it's going to take. And, the politics of the early republic or, this is a huge issue, especially in the difference between how these two main personalities in American politics at this time, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, how they respond to this Barbary Coast threat. And in fact, they've been working together on this Barbary Coast thing almost since the very beginning of America. So like they're the American legation in Paris whenever the first American ship is, as you were saying, because sort of what happens is prior to the American Revolution, United States shipping or American shipping was protected by the British Navigation Acts, which is they were very strong. You really don't want to go. If you're the Barbary Coast states, you don't want to take on the British Navy. And then during the Revolutionary War, we were protected by a treaty that extended French protection to American shipping. So, and then almost immediately, as soon as this protection ends, these Barbary states pounce. And it's Jefferson and Adams who are in London. I mean, they're in Paris, and they're initially the American diplomats that are called to go. They have to travel to London to go deal with I think it was maybe Morocco this time, or
it was actually with Tripoli.
It was Tripoli.
So we have to keep in mind this is also before the Constitutional Convention in 1787. This is during, of course, this is prior to the U.S. Constitution. We're dealing with Articles of Confederation foreign policy here, which is going to shape sort of American diplomatic response to not only the Barbary Coast states, but really how we start dealing with foreign country. And I mean, these are quasi-autonomous states, but I mean, this is also going to shape and reflect our relationship with Northern European states as well. And this sort of relates to the quasi-war later on. But yeah, so this is like 1786. I think it's in March. They go to London because this is right after last year. So July of like 1785, these schooners get captured. And they demand $660,000 per boat.
And that's not adjusted either. That's not like adjusted for like contemporary dollars. That's 600,000 Spanish silver dollars, because it's going to be the mark. That's real at this point in time. That's still going to be the mark of still the currency of note.
Yes.
In the world, it's a Spanish silver dollar. It's 660,000 of them at a time when the total American government's operating budget was around 10 million. Okay, so this is like an extraordinary sum of money that they're being asked to pay. What are essentially, I mean, even the American state is new, okay, and it's it's entirely untested, but there is no reason to expect that the United States, if it manages to throw all of its weight, behind one single issue, that it can't kind of mop up with these, with these like little tiny independent Islamic, polities, I guess is what you would call them. So it is kind of a brash, it's very steep ransom. And one of the things that's interesting is, like you said, this is pre-Constitution. So they're really, you can almost refer to it as the American provisional government. And one of the things, I think I've referred to this before, Jefferson and Adams, when you talk about the Constitutional Convention, Jefferson and Adams are not really involved in the Constitutional Convention. Part of it is because they're acting essentially as America's representatives in Europe. They represent the entire American state to most of Europe. And this arrives this summons to go to London and meet with these people arrives at a time when Ben Franklin, who has been the American presence in Europe for most of the previous 20 years at this point, he's left. He's gone back, and he does end up participating quite a bit in the Constitutional Convention. But Jefferson and Adams are both relatively youngish still at the time, political figures. They don't have a lot of the seasoning that a figure like Ben Franklin has, and they're called on to come resolve this very early instance of the Barbary States taking American ships, and they don't really have a unified plan. And, they end up having, slightly different responses to this meeting that are going to end up coloring the next 15 or 20 years or so of American politics. And there's a lot at once, sorry.
Well, yeah, and I think it's an important thing to contrast, say, the foreign policy chops of Thomas Jefferson and John Adams compared to Ben Franklin. For those who aren't familiar with sort of America's revolutionary history, or its, I guess, secession from empire, whatever term you want to use, a lot of the go-between prior to hostilities broke out was that Benjamin Franklin had some of the closest connections to London. And so when there was the situation about, say, direct or representation or indirect representation about the American colonies to Parliament, Benjamin Franklin would play a vital role in that relationship and would later be one of the primary envoys to France before John Adams and Jefferson would sort of accompany him later in the Revolutionary War. But so, yeah, the 1786, Jefferson and Adams are in London to sort of talk about with Tripoli's envoy. And I think his name is like C.D. Abrahamon or something like that. And so, they said, look, we haven't done anything to you. This is a ridiculous amount of money that you're asking for. We've caused you no injury. And the ambassador had given a rather, what I would say, diplomatic boilerplate Islamic response. Quote, "It was written in their Quran that all nations which did not acknowledge the Prophet were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave, and that every Muslim who was or Mussulman was slain in this warfare was sure to lead to go to paradise. He said also that the man who was first to board the vessel had one slave above his share, and that they were sprang from the deck of the enemy ship. Every sailor held a dagger in each hand and a third in his mouth, which usually struck terror in the foe that cried for quarter at once." And so you're kind of getting, listen, my hands are tied. Our prophet says that we have to do this. So Jefferson and Adams write a report to who is then the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, John Jay, who will soon be later on the Supreme Court of the United States after serving as Secretary of State. He says, listen, this is what we're to do. And this is where we get to really see Jeffersonian foreign policy emerge very early before his time in the White House, or also in Washington's cabinet. And there's a great article on this by, I think it's like James Sofka wrote this forever ago, about the Jeffersonian idea of the national security state. But he writes this report to John Jay, and he's arguing that, listen, if we pay more, we're only going to illustrate that we're going to take this line down and we're going to just pay them off like the British and the French, and that this thing is going to continue, and we can't do this. Where Adams sort of agrees with him, but his emphasis is that the United States needs to build a navy as soon as humanly possible to defend its merchant interests. And so we're getting this emergence, actually, at the same time, this cultural emergence of slavery narratives. So during, the beginning of the American sort of settling, or the English settling of the New World, there's always been this desire, this cultural intrigue about what life as a white European is like under slavery. And so this is where you kind of get the phrase like white slavery. And this has been going back, of course, with the Barbary pirates. This doesn't just happen with respects to the English or Americans. I mean, this had been going on since the 1500s. So you've got like 300 years of this enslaving of Christian, European, white merchant marine and civilians. That the numbers vary from like 1 to 2 million people over the course of 300 years. But this begins to come back to America, and it really starts to get into the
point out that's
culture.
A lot of people.
Yeah.
That's 1.25 million. It's a lot of people. That'd be a lot of people by today's standards. I actually don't know, but like, see, what is the population of England in the 18th century? We'll do United Kingdom population. Oh, you can all hear that.
But yeah, I mean, these are the things that will play a role. And this is and I want you to think about this. This is happening at the same time that sort of America's treaties and American government finally gets itself rather situated with the Indian peoples at the time as the American nation gets settled. So this is in the backdrop of the King Philip's War. This is in the backdrop of the 7 Years' War. This is in the backdrop, of course, in respects to all of these sort of Indian captive narratives that have been very popular throughout the time. And even before that, there was also, of course, the idea of dealing with India, the subcontinent, and the relationships to the whites there. And so you've got this very strong cultural zeitgeist about what does it mean to be in captivity. And this would actually translate into two ways. One, it would lead to sort of this jingoistic, we have to attack, we have to fight back and liberate these people for obvious reasons. And then the second one is that it would also play a major role in America's early abolitionist movement as early as the 1790s, where these depictions of Barbary captivity would then be used to usher in abolitionist language for freeing American slaves. But I take it you have the number now, Sandbactch.
I do have the number. I was going to say the number is total population of the United Kingdom in year 1801 was around 9 million. So if you imagine it's less than this over the previous century. So we're not talking about 1 million on the hundreds of millions of people. I guess probably about a little over 300 million people probably live in Europe right now. We're talking about like 1.2 million, and all of these are going to be heavily concentrated in countries that are doing a lot of maritime trade around the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea. So it's going to be England, Spain, France. That's about 1.5 million people over the course of 3 centuries that are captured and sold into slavery. And sometimes, by the end of the 18th century, the zone that these Barbary pirates are operating in has shrunk significantly. But actually, whenever we talk about, you go back to Pirates of the Caribbean or whatever, and there'll be scenes from Pirates of the Caribbean where, they'll flash out to, areas where there's lots of piracy other than in the Caribbean. One of the, there are a couple of these hot spots where piracy tends to occur. One of them is in another chapter. We're talking about the Horn of Mexico, which is what we call the Yucatan Peninsula today. Spanish treasure fleet had to sail between the Yucatan Peninsula and the Cuban island. That's a choke point for pirates. Mouth of the Mediterranean is another choke point for pirates. Always has been, always will be. Horn of Africa is another one. And then the fourth one is the Straits of Maluka, which I think you covered recently on another stream. These are all the places the pirates are going to tend to collect. And by the 18th century, the Barbary pirates are pretty well restricted to this area immediately around the Mediterranean Sea. But in previous centuries, it would not have been unusual for these Turkish slaving expeditions. They went as far north as England. They raided the Irish coast a number of times. They went as far as Iceland. They captured people from Iceland. So, for several centuries, they were able to operate with impunity. They've sort of been constricted by the end of the 18th century. But there's still definitely a threat. And in some ways, they've become more of a threat because they have, this sort of quasi-official backing from kind of the Ottoman government, and they've learned to sort of play politics. So, like, as we move along, we'll start to see the Barbary pirates will they'll take a geopolitical alignment in favor of the British or in favor of the French, depending on how the Napoleonic Wars play out. But I just did want to go back to and point out, this is because Thomas Jefferson is kind of a specialty of mine. In fact, a lot of you who think that I'm infuriating, it's probably a lot of the Jeffersonian influence, because Thomas Jefferson was an infuriating person. And his reaction to to this message, to this explanation for this ambassador for why he needs to pay, pony up $660,000 to pay off these people from interfering with American shipping. Jefferson has this, he's actually the first American to use the word ideology as far as I'm aware of. So he has, on one hand, Thomas Jefferson, and he's really sort of impressing himself on the spirit of the United States as a rule, as a whole. Whenever he makes these kind of snap judgments, and whenever he deviates from his own flight plan, because Jefferson has this entire, in Notes from the State of Virginia and in his writings, he has this incredibly beautiful, almost self-contained vision for what he thinks the United States is. And over, he will go on. He's like, he doesn't think we need armed forces because he thinks, that the spirit of America is commerce. And as we move on, we'll start to see he thinks the future of America is to the West, and that the United States needs to concentrate almost entirely on westward expansion and leave the problems of the old world behind. There's another aspect to Thomas Jefferson who just sometimes absolutely cannot stand the things that he hears, and he'll fly into a rage and react against them. And Thomas Jefferson, I don't even know much about him. The way he sort of thinks of himself cosmically, and the way he places himself religiously, and the role, the different roles that he imagines the state, and the different relationship between state and religion, compared with what he's encountering here in the the Barbary Coast states. And he hears this, he's told, you have to pay us $660,000 to get us to not continue to obey our God, is essentially the way he reads this situation, and he gets very angry. Okay, I mean, this is an instance where Jefferson's gut reaction essentially to encountering theocracy, like real theocracy, for the first time, and he kind of gets a burn his britches about it, and it's not going to go away. As somebody who's spent a lot of time with Thomas Jefferson's, with Thomas Jefferson's writings, with his thought, there's no doubt in my mind that at this point, this very first encounter, he's already decided these people have to be destroyed. It's not so. On one hand, we have this isolationist, manifest destiny style vision for America. On the other hand, he also imagines the United States as a force that is going to stamp out these sort of backward superstitions. This is the Empire of Liberty concept from Thomas Jefferson. We see them run into each other, as they so often will. Thomas Jefferson's concepts and his personality are going to run into one another. And usually, especially the period that we're talking about, Thomas Jefferson's personal predilections usually went out over his own ideological prescriptions. And this is just one of these things that we'll see moving forward.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to understand sort of Jefferson's mind of commerce in relationship to international affairs, because you do also begin to see how commerce and sort of national security are going to get linked together with respects to this. Because as America at this point in time, Jefferson sort of realizes that he's just witnessed, at least historically, both not only America's Revolution, but prior to that, of course, you have the 7 Years' War, or how we call it, the French and Indian War, but also the fact that even prior to that, the dealing of New York, formerly being New Amsterdam, these illustrate sort of that all these great old world powers recognize the vast commercial investment and enterprise that can come from the North American continent, now this new country, the United States. And so in 1785, he writes this he writes this letter in sort of relating to the issue of international trade and commerce with the old world. He says this to John Jay in 1785, and he says that one of the consequences of America, slowly coming to power. America's not going to be this great international power for some time. And he recognizes that this will lead to quite a bit of conflict as others seize upon American weakness. And so he writes about American property, and he says, quote, it will be violated on the sea and in foreign ports. Their persons will be insulted, imprisoned, and for pretended debts, contracts, crimes, contraband, etc. These insults must be resented, even if we had no feelings yet to prevent their eternal repetition. Or in other words, our commerce on the ocean in other countries must be paid for by frequent war. The justest dispositions impossible in ourselves will not secure us against it. It would be necessary that all other nations were just also. Justice is indeed on our part will save us from those wars which we would have been produced by a contrary disposition. But how will we prevent those produced by the wrongs of other countries? By putting ourselves in a condition to punish them. Weakness provokes insult and injury, while a condition to punish it for it often prevents it. The reasoning leads to the necessity that for some naval force, that being the only weapon with which we can reach the enemy. I think it is in our interest to punish the first insult, because an insult unpunished is the parent of many others. We are not at this moment in the condition to do it, but we should put ourselves into it as soon as possible. So he and Adams, despite sort of their historical disagreements later in their political careers and then eventually their later friendship, you know, Jefferson's just like, listen, we need to slap these people back as soon as relatively as possible, because if not, a perceived view of weakness from other states, including these quasi-independent Muslim states, are going to put us in a position to be picked upon forever. And I mean, we're really going to see that throughout the 1800 to 1814, the sort of quasi-war that we'd see with the French as things get rowdy and the revolution. But I mean, even here, right, we're seeing it happen.
Yeah, I mean, this is a couple of things that are worth pointing out. This is a period in which, because people will also, they'll tend to think of like that the Continental Army is something that continues to exist after the American Revolution, or that the American Navy is something that always really doesn't at this point. In the 1780s, it really doesn't at all. The Continental Army has been reduced to a couple of regiments. What is the name of that battle that the Indians the Native Americans just absolutely trounced us in? America is, I mean, this is a consistent habit that just real quick, the level of autonomy that Barbary States had, just coming in from the chat, they were almost entirely independent of the Ottomans at this point. They just had what you would call basically kind of like a letter of marque that, they nominally operated basically a little bit under the authority of the Ottomans. But then again, yeah, to go back, the United States, its military position is bad. Its army has been reduced to almost nothing. The Navy essentially doesn't exist. And there's it's easy to really talk about a lot of differences between Jefferson and Adams, because people will tend to want to play up the differences between Jefferson and Adams. People even in their own time did, and we'll see a little bit of that moving forward. But I think you could get their positions, at least initially, they actually line up better than they might initially seem to. Both of them agree that this is something that's going to have to be dealt with at some point. You can see the more bureaucratic procedural mind of John Adams at work, where he says, well, we're going to have to pay this right now, but we do need to quickly establish a Navy, and put ourselves in a position where we can deal with this. Whereas the Jeffersonian mind doesn't think about things like the practicalities, quote, whether or not we have a navy or anything like that. He's just going to say we need to declare war and kill them all now, whether or not we have the ability to do that. Now, like I said, I think that they both have this idea that this is something that's going to have to be confronted, because the United States is doing a lot of trade in this region. The Barbary pirates, operate in. They both agree that something's going to have to be done with it. But Jefferson, and this is one of the things that makes him despite the fact that he's a very quiet, soft-spoken person, the people that would call themselves Republicans, and the people that will fix themselves to his political banner tend to be what we would think of today as the populists, because they're kind of rowdy. The Trump supporters of the world would have been in Jefferson's camp in the 1800 election, because he's got this, he's running on this banner on this banner of democracy, the will of the people, and the people were angry about this Barbary pirates thing, and they kind of agreed with Jefferson. They said, no, we need to kill him now. And so this is another one of these really interesting distinctions between the personage of Thomas Jefferson and the political positions he represents, because he's personally kind of a quiet guy, soft-spoken. He actually never gives a public address as president of the United States, yet he's perceived as being the candidate that represents, American democracy, the will of the frontier republic. And this is an interesting distinction, that, interesting dichotomy between, his personality and the way he tends to actually behave. But I don't think there's as much space between the Adams position and the Jefferson position as there might initially seem like there is.
Yeah, no, they're almost, I would say, pretty congruent in respects to this one, that above all things, a navy has to be built prior hand. And this is the case that it is. And to go back to Zillionaire's point about sort of the level of autonomy that these states had, this was basically, these guys were more or less independent. You have to understand that, of course, the Ottoman Empire had fallen into some sort of decrepit economic and political situation, especially after its war with Russia from 1768 to 1775. I think is when that war ended, off the top of my head. I really can't remember. So, I mean, there's a large amount of latitude for those states, Algeria, Tunisia, or Tunis, and Tripoli. What you would call the Ottoman port. But of course, the Ottoman Empire is not in a position to really have direct political control over those. And so these three are more or less the idea that piracy is the foundation to their economic and political system, because, prophet says do it, so we're going to do it, and God can close his eyes for 660,000 silver dollars a ship. And so, these were the lavish forms that they were going to do with respects to the Navy. And now, of course, the United States, being this new and independent country, has to deal with these prohibited costs and measures. And sometimes, we say $660,000 or silver dollars in Spanish silver dollars, but also this could be as high as £1 million at the time. I'm not even adjusting it for inflation. We're talking about £1 million for ship and its crew to come back. And that wouldn't mean that you would get your cargo back either, even if it had went well. So at this point in time, you have this very conscientious problem that even the British Empire is aware of. Even as America settles itself and its independence with its former imperial rule. Lord Sheffield had said 1783 that the Barbary States are dangerous to the maritime power is a certainty. If they were suppressed, the little states of Italy and Sicily would have much more of the carrying trade that we see as a direct threat to us. The French never showed themselves worse politicians than encountering the late armed neutrality, of course, in respects to the revolution. They would have been, let me see if I can read that right. It would have been hurtful, consequently, to the pirates of the Mediterranean were viewed by continental diplomats as important elements of the regional as well as European balance of power. And so those are the things to definitely keep in mind. This is a very early use of the phrase balance of power as well. So we're really beginning to see this emerging form of modernity, as Sandbactch was talking about, with a sort of Colasec conceptual history we're going to bring into. But of course, until 1783, a lot of all of American maritime traffic is under the British flag and under its protection. Now, of course, this is going to change as soon as we're flying our own flag. Insurance rates are driving up to exorbitant levels, meaning that Americans are no longer capable of making as much trade into the Mediterranean and trading with Italy or Morocco or any other Mediterranean state at the time. And then, of course, profitable trade could not be developed, in part because of expenses ranging from the ransoms that were being held, maritime insurance, and now, of course, the uneasy relationship between France as well as Great Britain at the time.
I was wondering if you were going to bring up the maritime insurance, because this is one of these things that people just don't talk about very much, and it's like one of the things that it makes me was some of the dark matter missing in the, the history of maritime and international trade generally. But again, really, especially in Boston, and this is one of the reasons why Jefferson gets a lot of support out of New England for this, over even John Adams, who's at this point in time, he's making himself kind of a mockery. And, this is when he starts being referred to as, his rotundity, etc. During his presidency, his inaction on the Barbary pirates issue. But the main industry in New England is in fact shipping, and the only thing at the time that's keeping American shipping even competitive with French and British shipping is the fact that New England had in the previous centuries, it had established itself as purveyors of this maritime insurance. Okay. And you can still see evidence, you can still see echoes of this down to today, where I think it's either Hartford, Connecticut, or Providence, Rhode Island. It's the insurance capital of the Western Hemisphere. All of these firms that exist in the Atlantic Northeast that provide insurance for damn near everything. One of the reasons they're able to keep American shipping, American merchant shipping, competitive with the French and British during this time is because they're offering really extraordinary, drastically lower rates for American maritime insurance than they're able to get either from France or Britain. But and these Barbary pirate, ship seizures, they're not that frequent. Okay. They don't happen all that often, though I will say over the course of 20 years, there are estimated over 5,000 people, not cargoes, over 5,000 people captured and ransomed or sold into slavery in the Barbary slave market. And the possibility of even, just upping the claim rate. So like, okay, when you're insuring these shipping cargoes, that's going to be, it's a relatively large it's a large amount of money that you're insuring relative to the premium that you get. Okay. And so you can't afford for that rate of insurance claim, the rate of times that the insurance has to pay out on lost cargoes. You cannot afford for that to get very high. Otherwise, you have to start adjusting your premiums up drastically. And this ends up making American trade relatively non-competitive. So like when people will try to look at this and say, what is America, like libertarians or something like that, they'll look at this and be like, America's been warmongering since the very beginning. And I'm like, well, yeah, there's some truth to that. They have been, there's no way to frame this. America's early expeditions in the Islamic world look almost exactly like its later expeditions in the Islamic world, and for a lot of the same structural reasons. But to claim that the United States has no interest in shutting down this Barbary pirate issue is it doesn't really get the whole pictures. It doesn't really get the whole picture. There's definitely a very strong national interest here. Have to be able to keep those shipping rates down in order for America to be competitive with these two much larger colonial empires that, frankly, it shouldn't be on a level playing field with at all. The fact that it is immediately so competitive is problematic for both France and Britain. And it does mean that America has to move from being this collection of semi-autonomous colonial states to an actual coherent, nation with a modern foreign policy and a modern diplomacy and a modern navy almost instantly, because the parasites and the people who prey on weak states immediately pounced, because everybody knew what this American nation was going to turn into if it was allowed to proceed unmolested. That's a good YouTube word.
The other thing to keep in mind, right, is that there's still the cultural, dare I say, cultural Christianity that's still in play here. I mean, we still often think of Jefferson, famously, of course, as a deist who calls the four evangelists biographers of the historical Jesus. But, at the time, right, there is still this strong Christian sentiment that, of course, exists with respects to the Barbary States. And what it meant for Christian slaves underneath the Barbary coasts and their leadership. And this is where we get the story of a man named James Cathcart, who would famously be an advisor to the governor of Algeria. That would help sort of play a major role in getting. This is before we declare war, mind you. So we do end up paying $800,000 for the release of American prisoners and a peace treaty with these places: Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli.
Again, every time you hear a number like that, that's like 10% of the national budget for the whole year. Like, boom, you can buy 2 frigates for that much. A frigate costs about $400,000. So you can buy 2 Navy ships that you can use to BTFO these pirate ships with each of the ransoms that are being paid. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, it's an important thing to put in mind. Like, this is crippling the American government. And this is later on in the 1790s. So this is when we have the federal government, or at least the earliest iteration that we have of it. We're in, like, the 5th or 6th iteration, how it is now, or on the, anyways. So, this is $800,000, around 6.5, so $650,000 or so dollars have to be paid up front. And then they want yearly, indefinitely, $21,600 in shipbuilding supplies and ammunitions would be given to the Dey and his family. So this was meant to prevent further piracy. And of course, this is where Jefferson gets royally pissed. I mean, this is actually one of the few times where there's almost like unanimity in sort of Washington's cabinet at the time. So the American Navy gets quickly recommissioned in 1794, and resulting to this, in part because you have a higher degree of ongoing military presence inside the Atlantic Ocean, both the British and the French. This all plays in the backdrop of the quasi-war and the XYZ affair, but that's later on. And so the United States Department of the Navy is officially founded later on in 1798, after it's recommissioned just a few years prior, and is meant to prevent further attacks upon American shipping in order to end the demands that the Dey and other members of the Barbary States would have it. Now, of course, anytime that America goes out to war and foreign policy, this is where the domestic politics over spending and taxation will come into it. Both Federalist and Democratic Republicans were all focused on the issue of how much of the burden of taxation would the country have to pay, and how this would be tantamount to extorting the New England industrial North in comparison to as much taxes that would be considerably less of the agrarian South. So we can kind of see this happen on. This is a perennial thing of all sort of democratic foreign policy, is that anytime that we have a foreign incursion or a foreign war, we're going to be debating about taxes at home. And you can see this happening right now with respects to the rank punditry over the war in Ukraine and how much money we've spent over it, which is, tens, if not tens and tens of billions of dollars. So at the time, right, we're having the issue of the respects to the naval expansion, whether or not this is going to be a problem. And of course, Jefferson is actually against his own quote unquote political faction or party at the time. Jefferson still believes that, of course, the future of the nation lies westward in its expansion, but recognizes that we can't expand anywhere if we're spending tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars a year paying tribute to these Muslims. So we have to end it now. And
right.
that's where you set up the big political debate. And this would actually play a large part as well in the 1800 presidential election.
Right.
You're getting American history and foreign policy history this stream, kids. Just
yeah, I mean, it has to be, because the two are really inseparable. Though, I mean, people will try to separate them, but that's kind of the thing that I do in history is different. Is I refuse to differentiate. You know, it's like, okay, so these things are all definitely affecting one another. But just for, you know, people who are especially Southern focused, and are, you know, especially familiar, refer to themselves as Jeffersonians. There's an ideological break. And again, like I said, Jefferson's the first American, as far as I know, to use the phrase ideology. And there is an ideological break within the Jeffersonian faction that occurs over almost specifically this issue. So there's inside the Republican faction, there are the Jefferson. Everyone is a Jeffersonian. And you know, including like Thomas Jefferson's his early protege, Thomas Randolph of Roanoke, and then there's John Taylor of Caroline. These are early Jeffersonian supporters. They're going to break with him over this Barbary pirate issue, and they consider themselves true dyed-in-the-wool Republicans, and they don't think the federal government has the ability to levy taxes, create a navy, and put it unilaterally under the command of, you know, the president of the United States. And they're going to break with him, and they're going to form this other faction that's very associated with the political economy of the state of Virginia, and they call themselves the Tertium Quids. And you also see them referred to as the Old Republicans, like old Bolsheviks or something like that. I don't know, but this is the issue that causes the break in the Jeffersonian faction between those who think, you know, that the federal government should have any power whatsoever. And, you know, so what you'll end up is you'll find this character, Thomas Jefferson, is usually referred to as the strongest critic of federal overreach and federal power in American history. His own supporters start calling him a tyrant at one point over his conduct in the Barbary pirate affair.
So yeah, so as these things play a major role in respects to, now keep in mind, 1794 is, and we have shipbuilding and costs to consider. So the American Navy gets recommissioned in 1794. Firepower is meant to be increased for the direct purpose of protecting the merchant marine and American commercial interests with Atlantic trade and shipping and exporting its goods to the old world, as well as into ventures into Mediterranean and African ports that are colonial. And of course, the Department of Navy is founded in 1798. And so this is where we get the fun question, because this is something that you'll hear a lot, and this is something that I definitely would have been ranting about. I still kind of do, about the congressional need or the congressional power that is enumerated in the Constitution about declaration of war. And we often say that, you know, that really does change after World War II, that we haven't declared wars anytime since. We have this authorization of use of military force, and this is what needs to be done. And we really begin to see, actually very early on, this debate over what presidential authority and command of the armed forces looks like. And this is at a time where, of course, you know, communication is not instantaneous, but, you know, the question of executive authority really does get questioned here. So, of course, you have the divisive election of 1800. You can go consult your lovely musical Hamilton about that, but I mean, just by all means, you can go read the literature yourself. So he gets inaugurated later on in 1801. Congress did pass naval legislation that says U.S. allows, we're going to give the president 6 frigates to use as he wishes in the event of declaration of war. Well, it's very convenient then that the Pasha of Tripoli demands $225,000. So $225,000. And I'll thankfully, the source I'm reading from, Scott, this adjusted for $2,010. So that's about $3 million. I'm sure it's more now because of inflation. So, you know, the government has to pay consular gifts every time that there's a new head of state to find a way to milk the democracy cow a little more, saying it was a long-standing tradition that new administrations have to pay consular gifts. So, you know, keep in mind, right, federal revenue, as he pointed out, is about $10 million. So Jefferson's not having any of this.
It's also worth pointing out, this is 6 frigates, okay? America, we'd like to mythologize these 6 frigates. I think one of them ends up being the, what is the name of that ship? Independence or something. Constitution. I think one of them is the Constitution. I'm Not certain. Don't quote me on that, even though I'm quoting myself on that. But these we earmark money for 6 frigates, okay? And a frigate, just to give you comparable comparative naval power that this generates, for show you how not a factor the United States was at the time. A frigate was at the time, it's the smallest class of ship that's considered even able to do something like cross the ocean by itself. So like we get these 6 frigates, we put it's just 2 squadrons of 3 is really what this is. And so we have these 2 squadrons of these ships that are capable of sailing across the ocean and engaging these Barbary pilots. These are not ships of the line. These are not like the HMS Victory is the other, the big famous late stage sailing class ship. There's 104 guns on that one. Frigate's gonna have more like 30 guns. Okay. These are not big ships by any means.
Yeah, no, and that's an important thing to keep in mind here. This is just not the biggest thing that we're going to be able to throw out there in terms of a ship of the line or anything that you might see out of Master and Commander or any other of Lord Nelson's fleet here. So, the Jefferson, of course, also has this issue of looking at the American economy in a uniform structure. We talk about that. A lot of people in our circles talk about this book. I know Blood Satellite did a really great review of it called Think Like a State, and think, more or less how does the USG or how does a respective government look at things as a whole and collectively.
Was it Think Like a State or Seeing Like a State?
Or Seeing Like a State, yeah, I think that's what it's called,
yeah.
Seeing Like a State. I don't know what, I Think Like a State's a chapter in that book, but
yeah.
Jefferson is now confronted, and this has been an ongoing debate, not before his presidency, but also during Adams's administration, as well as Washington's. And he is very adamant that, it's very awkward to look at American shipping and the American economy writ large as this collective sort of superstructure inside of like our foreign policy calculations, because these are all relatively new things. This is not something that, regionalized identities and regional governments, saying the Virginia House of Burgesses now, you're on the world stage, and you've got to really consider what that looks like. And so, during Adams's administration, he does write to John Adams, the president, that, listen, we need to strengthen our Navy. We need to do more about it. And of course, he lacks the political will to do so. He has no political capital in that respect. In part because Philadelphia at the time, where Congress is just, there's no capital for it. And so what would later come out of that, of course, is the need to have 6 frigates later on. And this sort of comes in the backdrop of the 1800 election as what would be called the Anti-Piratical Confederacy, to get a compromise in respects to dealing with the Mediterranean problem. Whereas Adams is far more focused, of course, on the burgeoning issues of the French, what we would call the Quasi-War, and the XYZ affair from 1797 to 1798. And it's just a lengthy, he's focused more up on the French, whereas he's looking in the greater picture of the Mediterranean and American shipping. So you're really beginning to see this difference of political opinion, but also how, when we're focused in the political tirades of one issue, we're not going to, it makes it harder to pay attention to the other.
There are some balances here, because this is a point in time where, and again, I always tell people it was funny when you think of the United States as its first war, its first military action in the old world. Like, who are the countries that it's aiding? Who are the countries it's involved with and cooperating with? Sweden and Sicily. What the hell? But one of the things is like Adams is nervous about striking too hard in one direction or the other on this Barbary pirates thing, because he is concerned. Jefferson, and this is one thing that is true. Okay, and there's a lot of bullshit in the 1800 election, but one of the biggest predictors of whether or not you're going to fall on one side or the other of this 1800 election is how you feel about France. How do you feel about revolutionary France? Okay. Or how do you feel about Napoleonic France? How do you feel about the ongoing revolutions in the Atlantic world? And the Federalists are if we're properly characterizing, these positions, the Federalists are the conservatives. And we can actually see this in the aesthetics of the way they govern. They're way more given to like sort of pomp and circumstance, to like aristocratic societies, to like hereditary societies. Like, what is that? Oh, Society of Cincinnatus is one. The whole presidency, the United States presidency, the whole federal government under the aegis of the Federalists is considerably more old world looking. You would recognize it more as like a parliamentary. There's a lot of military parades, a lot of pageantry, and there is a strong tendency to sympathize with the British position. Okay, the British. So there's a strong tendency among the Federalists. In fact, they get accused. The anti-Federalists accuse them all this of trying to actually of like low key like undoing the entire American Revolution, because they just want to glue us back to the underside of the British. Adams is not quite as doctrinaire on this sort of thing as Alexander Hamilton was. I mean, Alexander Hamilton arguably might have undone the revolution had he been given an opportunity to do so. He might have stapled us right back to the British. But Adams is a little more, Adams, he takes the middle route. He ends up making everybody angry. But one of the things he is really concerned about is these Barbary coast states. They have the ability to shift back and forth in these Napoleonic alliances. And one of the things he's really concerned about is America getting involved, driving them too hard one direction in the Napoleonic Wars, and then getting us sucked in to the larger Napoleonic Wars. Okay. Jefferson is considerably less concerned about that. He's perfectly okay with shoving these Barbary pilots straight into because in addition to hating religious theocracies, Thomas Jefferson also like genocidally despised the English. Okay, he hated British people, and he's perfectly willing to light the entire world on fire to embarrass a few rich Englishmen. So he's perfectly okay with shoving the Barbary, and this is we will eventually see the Barbary pilots do align themselves with the British in the Napoleonic Wars and create an interesting situation. But that's the second Barbary pirate war. Not the first one, but this is a consideration that John Adams is having to deal with at the time whenever he's formulating these policies. Jefferson is back in retirement at the time at Monticello and doesn't have to worry about suffering any consequences for the things he says, because he can be entirely ideological without having to worry about what to actually do whenever he's in power. So that's one thing to think about as well.
Yeah, and so as we had mentioned earlier, 1801, he's finally inaugurated. In May of 1801, the Pasha, Yusuf Kwarlamani, declares war on the United States for grounds of, I want to extort you more, because at the time, just earlier in the previous administration, the United States had settled on the accounts of its conflict with the Algerians. There was a treaty that had been made to sort of settle things out with Algeria, one of the Barbary states in that respect. Although it did cost them nearly $1 million to get that peace. And so Yusuf Kwarlamani just basically goes, yeah, no, you're not paying me enough. The other guy's getting more. And so war is the prudent option. This news, of course... Go ahead.
All we're saying is give war a chance.
Right?
I have to say it.
I'm sure our friends at Sunflower Society and P.G. O'Rourke is happy in his grave. But yeah, so give war a chance is what he's saying. And armed with 6 frigates that are explicitly given by Congress his authority to use, Jefferson finally gets to answer this 20-year-old question about what on earth do we do in the Mediterranean. And Jefferson has the political power and the naval strength to take action.
I just want to point out that I love the actual text of this. Like as an American, it's impossible not to have like a fuck yeah moment whenever you read this primary document where like Congress has, however this has happened, whether by hook or crook, he's managed to generate this congressional consensus. And mind you, this is one of the Randolph of Roanoke is in dissent here, so a lot of Jefferson's hardcore, like really extreme, libertarian, sorry Virginia, style supporters are angry about this. But you get this text where Thomas Jefferson has been placed in personal command of the American Navy is like that's metal as fuck. you don't see that sort of thing happen very often. It's like we're gonna put the American Navy directly under the command of the spirit of America. Is what happens here.
Yeah, a real embrace of the commander-in-chief possibility.
Yeah.
That is that we sort of attribute as a title, but in here he's just like, listen, I have 6 ships that have been expressly given to me. If these, Muslim Barbary States pirates want to declare war, if these corsairs want to do it, and he gets his war, although it's not one that it was certainly an inevitability. Very much back to those debates that Adams, Jay, Rutledge, and Jefferson would be having in the 1780s and 90s in their respective, parts in government, whether as Secretary of State, on the court, or in Congress. And so, Jefferson sort of recognizes that, like, this is the only action to do so. And in June of 1801, Jefferson wrote that the real alternative is whether to abandon the Mediterranean or keep a cruise in on it. And so, as we talked about earlier, this goes back as far as 1785, where he's arguing that, really buying settlement through tribute was pointless. And so he had said he was convinced that money is thrown away and that there was no end to the demand of these powers nor any security in their promises. And well, he was certainly right from the 1780s onward. And so decision, of course, gets ready for war in May of 1801, once the declaration, what would anyone object to naval deployment in the Mediterranean? And of course, in Jefferson's own diaries and journals, that he actually had a pretty congruent opinion from all of his cabinet secretaries that, like, listen, we need to move fast and we need to move now. Although, there's no statements from what happened specifically in that meeting. James Madison, in a letter to William Eaton, the American consul in Tunis, had stated that Jefferson saw this as an appropriate moment to use American naval forces in the Mediterranean, not only as a provision against immediate danger, but as we are now at peace and amity with the rest of the world. This is following, of course, the issue with the XYZ affair. And as the forces employed at home would merely be at the same expense, be less advantageous to our mariners. So, as we're sort of in the backdrop of this quasi-war, we're also beginning to see things heat up between France and Britain. He's got 6 ships. A war has formally been declared. Thomas Jefferson says, all right, I'm going in. There's this. We're not going to debate whether or not war would be the effective option. Jefferson has already made this decision prior to even having this cabinet meeting and prior to even consulting Congress. And so this is where we talk about, I mentioned this earlier, we talked about the debate about congressional, the actual declaration of war for it. This is where we're really beginning to see early debates about how much power Congress is willing to concede to the president of the United States, but also at the same time, how much authority is the president willing to take, even when it's not explicitly enumerated to him in the Constitution. And this is in respects to war-making powers. And we're beginning to see this play out. And so, of course, he's aware of the fact that Congress does have the power of the purse and he's going to need support, but he's incredibly doubtful that he's going to get it. And that's why, this cabinet meeting was held, not because, war was necessary. He already knew this, but it was whether or not, how much power do I have to play with here?
Here's another interesting personality tidbit about Jefferson. So Jefferson's presidency falls, it's referred to as the textual presidency frequently. Okay. And in part, you can look at it today and call it the lazy presidency. But the way Jefferson's presidency plays out is that there are almost no meetings. Okay, this is very unusual for Jefferson to actually convene a meeting of his cabinet. The way this normally works is Jefferson will, at some point during the day, he would have every head of department every day, they would draw up a circular and they would have it copied out, have their little, copy minions, because there's no Xerox machines at the time. You have to employ a personal secretary to make copies of these things, circle them around to the other departments. And if they have any amendments or any revisions, then they have to make another set of changes and send them all back out. And so the entire Jefferson presidency is sort of famously conducted because, again, Jefferson is such a personal recluse. He does not like the possibility of having to face disagreement among his cabinet. Okay, so he doesn't like he's so, this is just an element of Southern chivalry and Southern honor culture that's going on here, but he doesn't like ever having to place his ministers in a position where they would have to publicly disagree with him. So he prefers to let them do it textually. He prefers these arguments to be hashed out in writing. This is very unusual that Jefferson has decided, because he is at this point, he's facing opposition from inside his own cabinet on this issue, actually. Whenever he has a meeting, this is whenever you're about to get the absolutist tyrant Thomas Jefferson that normal everyday Thomas Jefferson would normally also be against. But he's essentially, he's doing like a Schmittian, sort of sovereign move here, which is like, okay, we can, whenever we're talking about normal stuff, like whether or not we're going to build a bridge in Western New York, then this is all open for debate. But no, I'm the president now, and we're going to do this, is essentially what's going on. I just like to inject like little personality tidbits about Jefferson, because he's just such a wonderfully erratic person to keep track of.
Well, and I'm glad that you do this in part because Jefferson is not of the men of, like, I studied my degrees in American history, but it focused more so on the Constitutional Convention and sort of the legal framework behind that. So I can tell you far more about people like Madison and John Jay and Hamilton than I can Jefferson, which is a failure on my part. So I'm glad that you're on here for that purpose. But in the months after this declaration of war, Congress doesn't convene until December, early December. So you got this sort of, and of course, in typical agrarian fashion, Congress is off for the summer and for the harvest season. And of course, they will convene early December. And in this meantime, of course, we've already got the 6 frigates that are out there. And one of them is an American ship called the Enterprise. And this is from Virginia Magazine. This is an article about Jefferson, Congress, and the Tripolitan War. And this is in 1986. But he writes that on August 1st, an American ship Enterprise under Lieutenant Andrew Sterrett captured a Tripolitan cruiser, killing 20 crewmen and wounding 30 more. The Americans gutted the ship, threw the cannon and small arms overboard. Then, lacking the orders to take prisoners, they sent the crippled ship back to Tripoli. The Pasha vented his anger at the loss of his ship by parading the unlucky commander of a cruiser through the streets of Tripoli mounted backwards on an ass, with the entrails of a sheep draped around his neck. So there was some limited action. In some part, there was some minor victory at the time. So, of course, December comes around, and he's got to report to Congress. He has annual addresses that he is constitutionally required to give, what you might dare call the State of the Union. And he's got to tell them about what's going on. So Jefferson informs Congress that war happened while y'all were out, and I have taken a squadron of 6 ships into the Mediterranean, and he has a desire for peace, but he has a commitment to protect the United States and American sailors and punish all offenses against those that would insult the American flag. And he needs more power, and he needs more money. And he describes the actions of Lieutenant Sterrett to Congress. And he says, quote, unauthorized by the Constitution without the sanction of Congress to go beyond the line of defense, the Tripolitan vessel being disabled from committing further hostilities was liberated with its crew. Jefferson then came to this point, quote, the legislature will doubtless consider whether by authorizing measures of offense also, they will place our force on equal footing with that of its adversaries, end quote. And so the war, of course, has been done without authorization from Congress. And he's now asking for congressional cooperation and approval. In closing, he promised to send Congress information on the subject so it could act as soon as humanly possible. But instead, the House doesn't get info. It doesn't get anything from its secretaries or anything from the cabinet. No Minister of War to make a discussion. James Madison is not dispatched. And in fact, instead, Sandbactch pointed out, we get a very textual answer. What does the House get? The House receives a bill that was drawn up by the White House and his cabinet 6 days after Congress had heard Jefferson's message. And Robert Smith, the Secretary of Navy at the time, basically just lets his brother know, who's a congressional representative, what to do. And that it would be better for the president to be authorized by law and to utilize the full power of the purse and the full power of the United States against the Barbary States. And I just find that to be really interesting, because it echoes very similarly to how America gets its a lot of its marching orders from, say, the executive branch of government today. We can let you know about committee hearings, and we can inform you with classified briefings and records, but when we want something done, we'll either do it ourselves, or we're going to tell you what law we specifically need signed, preferably today, if not yesterday.
Yeah, like here's your compensation package. Just sign off on it. What we'll tell you. But this is one of these things. This is something that they have learned. This is an ideological conversation. All through American history is like, what exactly is the nature of this relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch? And purists will call themselves Jeffersonians, and they're not actually wrong. Will sort of frequently fall back on making the case that we need for some issue like I'm not going to use any of those words because we're already, but you can imagine the issue that I'm talking about whenever we refer to arbitrarily delegated congressional authority. Like, okay, yeah, the Congress needs to be able to make Congress needs to be able to needs to declare war or whatever like that. But Congress is also there's no actual rule that Congress can't wrap up as much of its own legislative power as it feels like, and then present it as a gift back to the president, which is essentially what Jefferson's asking them to do. And he's not personally certain whether or not he has the authority to do this yet, but he also has decided that it's not really a question that he can worry about philosophizing the answer for. He thinks he has to do it, so he goes and does it. But this is like one of these first instances where we see Congress is being asked to do something, but instead what actually happens is they get this missive from the executive branch that says, this is what you're going to do. You're going to sign over these powers to us for X amount of time, and then we're going to wield legislative power unilaterally while you're like picking cotton. Is essentially what happens. I have a lot of mixed feelings about whether or not this is a true and righteous interpretation of the U.S. Constitution, but it's definitely got precedent going as far back as the 18th century. Really, I'd be possibly even earlier if you want to go look at the yellow fever epidemic in 1790, but that's a totally different issue. This is the first time that it has foreign policy impacts.
Yeah. And the other thing to keep in mind is that we mentioned that wonderful, we mentioned the character of James Leander Cathcart, and throughout the entirety of this war and leading up to it, because he is the highest position any Christian slave can be. He is an advisor to the governor of Algiers, or the Bashaw, as some would call it. He's the go-to person for correspondence that the American government has to these Barbary states, and especially with respect to Algeria. And it gets awkward around halfway through, right before the war gets declared, in part because we stop hearing from him. Commentary and a lot of the literature will tell you that a lot of this has to do with the fact that war had been decided long before the election had even taken place. They had said that this is in respect to the treaty that had been signed, and later on in the 1790s, it would cost the United States quite a bit of money. But this is also in part due to the fact that they didn't want that much the other Barbary states, specifically Tunis and Tripoli, did not want that much influence to come out of one respective state. So you have this interfighting between the three Barbary states, or Corsair states, that are going on there. And so this also has the problem, for instance, that we're also just giving these guys really expensive shit. Like it's really, for example, this comes from the Journal of the Early Republic. This isn't from 1990, an article in 1996. Still, this is during the Adams administration. Adams treated Algiers and Tunis differently from Tripoli. Adams agreed to give the Bey of Tunisia a present of jeweled firearms purchased in England by the American minister Rufus King from His Majesty's personal gunsmith. Adams concluded that it was best to make the present costing $40,000 rather than hazard a rupture of the peace. and of course Adams, and then at his time, later would be replaced by John Marshall, Mr. James Pickering, to agree to these demands while not accommodating the needs for Tripoli or Algiers. And so these things play in mind of how do we keep the peace between these various Muslim leaders in these three states that would later be a major influence for why war gets started. And I just thought that little tidbit of trivia was interesting, that we blew $40,000 on a jeweled firearm that American Minister Rufus King bought from the Majesty's personal gunsmith.
Where was Rufus King from? I think he was one of the Pennsylvanians, wasn't he?
I believe so.
But yeah, no. But this, I love the finances of this early republic. It's like
he's from Massachusetts.
This is a substantial amount of the total budget, and it's like literally spend it on like Gucci bling for this, like, for this Mediterranean shake. Is sort of what's happening. And Jefferson is another one of these guys that'll do this. Actually, just one thing I always like tell people is that Jefferson spent over a third of his he spent over a third of his presidential salary on booze, like just wine that he personally consumed. But then there are reasons for that, and it's not really relevant. But if you keep bringing up the Cathcart character. The white slavery thing is one thing to say it over and over again until the algorithm comes and takes me away. But the white slavery narrative, first of all, when people refer to white slavery, this has sort of been mimetically charged, to refer usually to the Irish Americans that are held in indentured, sometimes slavery, sometimes indentured servitude, and a lot of times the academic conversation around white slavery will try to draw itself back this way. The Cathcart narrative is one of these really interesting ones, because if you go do something like, and just to give away that I've done this, if you go pull up ChatGPT and ask it about white slavery in the Barbary Coast Wars or something like that, Cathcart he's an example. This is like, if you want to see the artificial intelligence go absolutely crazy, go start asking it questions about this, because it will be the whole conversation around the slavery, around slavery markets, about the African slave trade. They're going to be, the contemporary narrative is going to try very hard to force conversation about white slavery into these more questionable examples of whether or not these Irish people were actually enslaved, whether or not they were indentured servants. The scale of the Irish slave trade, or the Irish indentured servitude slave, you're going to be redirected back towards that conversation and away from this one. And one of the things that's interesting is, because whenever I was looking for the, secondary sources, because I hadn't read them in a long time. Actually, the way this, the Barbary slave market for Americans crossed my path one time. I was in a university library looking for books on the slave trade, because I'm me, and I ran across this one. It's like it was a monograph from the 1920s, and I can't find it now, but it was an American slave narrative covering the he was an American Commodore, I think, or he served in one of these Commodore's expeditions. And he gets enslaved, and he's sold into Barbary slavery for a little over 7 years. He actually ends up on nutmeg. I think it was nutmeg or rubber plantation somewhere in Ethiopia. Okay, so there are a number of things that this narrative cuts through that nobody really likes to talk about. First of all, that plantation agriculture was not an explicitly Americans enslaving Africans from lower sub-Saharan Africa. This narrative cuts across that, because now all of a sudden these plantations that people want to talk about being evil. It's way easier to talk about it being evil if you talk about it being an evil Anglo-American white thing. And this narrative can kind of bend and encompass the southern, the South American Spanish plantations, though there's a tendency even then to make those seem less evil than the Anglo-American ones. But if you zoom out and you look at the global, and again, just to go back to the historical framework that we're using to talk about here, because I like to talk about modern world systems theory. I made a tweet the other day about how the American 19th century is really this sort of really the narrative is that we're kind of joining these worlds together, these little self-contained worlds. So we have the Atlantic world is one of these worlds, and then the Mediterranean world is another. The Mediterranean is a very famous one. It's a famous book called Mediterranean World in the Age of Philip II. So there's this second world, the Mediterranean. Then there's this third world, which is the Arab trade world. Now there's a tendency to want to land plantation agriculture and land the slave trade explicitly in the context of the triangle trade in the Atlantic basin. So there's a tendency to want to say that plantation agriculture, the African slave trade, these are curiously European evils that are perpetrated on Native Americans and African Americans. Okay. This narrative, like this one travel narrative that I'm talking about, and the numbers weren't that big for Americans. We've talked 1 to 1.5 million Europeans over the course of 300 years, but it was several thousand Americans over the course of a couple of decades. So I mean, the numbers aren't big, but they were alarming at the time. There was enough. This was happening enough to really keep people interested. And the other thing that it does, though, is it really puts the screws on this global historical narrative of plantations being a curiously Anglo-American evil, where we have this American character who gets sold into like nutmeg plantation slavery, and he's like down in like Eritrea is the modern country that he would be in. So, plantation agriculture is global at the time. It's already global because plantation agriculture becomes one of the mechanisms for connecting these different trading worlds together. And they do it through commerce. They do it through this slave trade, because like, how does this man that's born in Massachusetts end up in slavery in Eritrea? We have significantly globalized markets that enable this, and kind of the kayfabe that leftist historians are able to use to try and sidestep this is to totally differentiate the Barbary slave trade from the triangle slave trade. But this is one of the things that I'm one of these people that I'm going to look at this in the context of world systems theory, and I'm going to say that no, you can't delineate this Atlantic basin slave trade as different from this Muslim this slave trade is moving in the other direction. The only difference is what direction the people that were purchasing slaves came from. It's the same market. It's the same market, the same inputs, the same people are selling these slaves. But another one of the things is that this Carhart narrative kept coming up. And this Carhart narrative is really the artificial intelligence, and probably a lot of, academic historians will try and tell you that, that white slavery, that this white Barbary slavery was significantly different from African-American slavery, from the African-American chattel slavery. And it's really not. Okay, but they'll use this what is his name? I want to say Carhart, but Cathcart. It's Cathcart. Yeah. I'm just Carhart. So I'm trying to get you an endorsement. But they'll use this guy as an example and say, well, he rose to the highest position possible, and he was advising the Bay of Tripolitana, okay, or whatever. And so this proves that this slavery is somehow different from the slavery that's occurring in the America, where there are literally no examples of trusted African Americans becoming senior advisors, to those that have enslaved them. But then they point out, just like, oh yeah, every plantation manual ever is signed by the one literate slave. Jefferson himself, makes frequent use of his slaves as as sometimes closer advisors than even some of his nominal white allies or something like this. It's a very strange narrative that leftist historians try to spin around this. So like, well, he's the advisor, this white slave becomes the advisor to the Bay of Tripolitana, and then like well, yeah, the Hemings family are some of the closest advisors to the president of the United States. How is this slavery really different? And so that's, if you ever get a chance to get in an argument with leftist or just somebody who's an idiot, about the slave trade. Go talk about these guys. And there's a website that you can go to that have this, because these travel logs, whites sold into slavery narratives. They were very popular at the time. But
you can read it. I'm just gonna give you the name right now. It's called The Captives: 11 Years a Prisoner in Algiers. Go read it to your heart's content. It's free online. You can get a PDF right now if you look it up. It's on the Internet Archive. Go do it. And this guy, and the reason why I say this character is so interesting, though, is because he's a slave in Algiers for 11 years. Rises up to be the chief clerk of the bay in Algiers, and is the reason why we get a treaty.
He needed one more year to get a movie made about him. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Continue.
If only he was a slave for one more year. But no, he works for the U.S. minister. He gets in contact with the U.S. minister to Portugal, one of the earlier countries that recognizes a sort of America's independence, alongside Morocco and a few others. We get the Treaty of Algiers, as we mentioned, and that buys his freedom, and so he gets the hell out of there. Only, of course, to be brought back from 1796. 2 years later, he's back in the Barbary coast in 1798 as our consul to Tunis and Tripoli, and he plays a large role in our respect to the Tripolitan War, what we would call the Barbary War, the war with the Barbary States. It's just he's proof of what this was like. This is a rare instance of what I would call a good ending for many white slaves enslaved from Mohammedans in the time period. But he plays a large role in this, and this is a small snippet of American history, but illustrates the history of American foreign policy as early as the turn of the 19th century. It still plays a role today in American foreign policy, and I feel the need that this stuff needs to be addressed, because who else is going to tell you about this stuff other than myself or Sandbactch? And so to get back to the war, as he's declared it, the textual president hands back this bill to Congress saying, this is all the information you need. Please pass the law and let the president sign it so he can continue to execute his office as commander-in-chief of the United States Navy and its armed forces. And now, in the meantime, as we've talked about earlier already in this discussion, there's already some quibbling and internal dispute over this Jeffersonian Republican faction inside of Congress and inside of his own government. Not that the war needed to be executed or prosecuted. That was certainly an agreement. It was whether or not he had the authority to do so. And so the bill doesn't get looked at until the 7th of January, when finally the whole House gets the opportunity to refer it again to the Committee of the Whole. Again, this is from Virginia Magazine. John Randolph of Roanoke interjected a new question into the debate 4 days later when he moved a resolution directing the Secretary of the Treasury to give the House an estimate of the value of exports to the United States for the last 5 years to ports situated within the Straits of Gibraltar, so everything inside the Mediterranean Sea. Samuel Smith feared the resolution because Congress might repeat the mistake from an earlier administration weighing the cost of protection against the benefits of trade. Washington and Adams had found humiliation cheaper than action and followed the path of bribery. Knowing the mind of President Jefferson, Smith advocated for the use of force. Randolph resolution passed, and Gallatin complied with the request, but the report did not have the effect. On the 21st of January, the House held another short debate on the original bill to grant expanded authority to the president. The bill passed the next day and went to the Senate, where it passed in a slightly amended form on the 1st of February. No breakdown of the roll calls exists or were recorded. However, we do know that the law was passed, and it granted him almost unlimited control of American relations with respect to the Barbary pirates. So Jefferson, after taking action, did the thing and then asked for permission and forgiveness later, and he did get exactly what he wanted. And so Jefferson manages to go on, despite there being no official declaration of war. Never at any point in time after that resolution was passed on the 1st of February, 1802, did Congress ever ask to, declare war or to ask for more authority over the executive branch than the legislative. And so you really begin to see some of the earliest examples of a stronger executive authority taking control and Congress willingly ceding it to the executive of the United States government. And we still see this a lot happen to its day, although it is in a much more bureaucratized, technocratic form. It still exists.
But you would point out that, who's the president that we point to all the time when we say that this bureaucratization starts under? Who is it? Who's the president that we say? Who's the president that we always point at? We say that this is.
Am I about to get like an
It's coming.
Is this
It's
the
coming.
Wilson apologia that I'm about to get?
Yes, it sure is. And I always like to point out that Woodrow Wilson is.
I don't blame Woodrow Wilson for the bureaucratized form of government. I actually blame someone entirely else. But go on, go on your little rant, Sandbactch.
But Wilson is the guy. He's famously, people point at him as he's the guy that forces. It's not the 55th Congress, but it's 65th Congress or something like that. He forces them to bundle. This is the Federal Reserve Act. There's there's a sense where Congress is bundling up the power of the person, discharging it to this private individual, and this group of private individuals, and it's happening all the time. The American Medical Association. This is. Organization has no actual government, government authority on their own unless Congress just gives them some. It's like, here you have the ability to self-regulate the medical, the entire medical establishment in the United States. These are things that the early argumentation in favor of being able to do this looks back at Thomas Jefferson and says, look, he did it. And, which is, I always think it's really fascinating because it's a lot of times it's people that call themselves Jeffersonians that will be against this. But I also like to point out that, that will be against this kind of behavior, but I also like to point out that they're not wrong. Because whenever we talk about Jefferson as the first guy that establishes this sort of ideological blueprint for how to be an American. We call him, not anti-federalist, because Jefferson wouldn't have gone that far. But Jefferson, he's considers himself an advocate of a very limited power of the executive government. But then, so that's the ideological Jefferson position is in fact that no, Congress should not be devolving a lot of these authorities away from itself to, relatively, unhinged, or unshielded, unchecked, arbitrary bureaucratic bodies or the executive branch. But then we see the other side of Jefferson, the person who's totally okay with it. There's not a single instance whenever Jefferson's ideology and Jefferson's personal prescription for what, he needs to do as president of the United States. When these two things conflict, Jefferson, the person, wins every time. Okay. So I don't know, what does Jeffersonian mean at this point? Because, Jeffersonian at one point, you have this ideology, but then on the other hand, you disregard it every time you feel like not paying attention to it. So it's like, you be Jeffersonian, do all kinds of stuff. But, it's like I always like to point out, there are these massive inconsistencies in the thought and the actions of Thomas Jefferson that, people can claim to be Jeffersonian and be right both times. Both of these groups of people can claim to be Jeffersonians and they're both right.
When you're Thomas Jefferson, they let you do it.
Right, yeah. Like when you're Thomas Jefferson, you can do anything you want. Except maybe, well, never mind. Okay.
Well, the one thing Thomas Jefferson did not do was sire any children with.
I was gonna do. That's exactly
he never did
where
that.
I was going.
He never did that. And I will pull out everything from the Abbeville Institute to back that shit up. But anyways, so Congress, of course, authorizes this authority, and the war is then prosecuted to its effect. And so, after, of course, in 1802, Jefferson gets the authority to deal it. President gets all authority for the protection of commerce and seamen of the United States against Tripolitan cruisers. And to do so, he begins his battle. And there are really two major ones to really pay attention to. You get the Battle of Tripoli Harbor and the Battle of Derna, which is a decisive military victory with some mercenaries, and then, of course, the United States. But this is later into the war in 1805, the earlier one being in 1804 in July, which is the second Battle of Tripoli Harbor. And again, this is at a time where, we had tried attacking earlier throughout the year, which had led to no real success. There was some loss of men from a fire ship. I think it was like USS Intrepid. But, it continued to keep bombarding it. Although with really no degree of success. There was just some lost ships and we had lost quite a bit of what's the word I'm looking for? We lost one frigate at the time, but it wouldn't really be until the United States Navy and the United States Marine Corps finally get to do what they want, which of course is set in 1805. So, but at the same time, you have not just the United States conducting this war. Like, we're not alone in this respect. We are working with Sweden at the early part of the war in 1801 and 1802, because they're also concerned about their own merchant interests in the area. Keep in mind, they're not nearly as large of a colonial power. They're not nearly as involved in respects to sort of the great power conflicts on the continent or with England.
And they are almost as far away from Tripoli. So again, like, it's another one of these things that anybody who's ever played Europa Universalis, you know, if you, like, I love doing this. Paul's like, yeah. And anybody who's ever, you know, played any of these games is you can't just dispatch your fleet to the other side of the world. Like, you do need a port somewhere for them to hang out in. You know, because there's food and you have to, you know, refresh water, everything like that. So yeah, there is, and they need a local power to at least sign off on this, and it ends up being, I think it's Kingdom of Two Sicilies, King Ferdinand the 39th, or I think it's Ferdinand the 6th, the one. You know, somebody in the chat, I'm playing EU4 right now, but yeah. Also for Jake, I'm gonna go dig up the Abbeville Institute newsletter that highlights my contributions to the Institute, and I'm gonna post it for you next time I come on.
But this is just that bizarre coincidence, because yeah, they're just as far, and they had been at war since 1800 with them, and we just happened to come along with our own consequences. Just this bizarre. Everything sort of fell together in that.
Yeah, I didn't look into what exactly, because Sweden being involved is so strange to me, and I knew that, and I meant to go look up what exactly.
Gustav IV was the king of Sweden at the time. I think he gets deposed in like a coup just a few years later after this war ends. But yeah, so they've been at war with them for more or less the same reasons since 1800, and Thomas Jefferson, of course, had his foreign minister sort of, you know, make this work with these powers that would come about. Of course, they weren't involved in the full prosecution of the war, because I think they settle, or they get what they want in 1802, and we kind of continue to prosecute the war until 1805.
Yeah, but I mean, again, it's one of these things. Like, he's like, we talked for an hour and a half. With an hour and a half, and like the actual war itself is like 5 minutes of the discussion. It's actually kind of a boring war. It went about as well, and I don't know if I can say this on YouTube, but it went exactly as well as you would expect a naval war between predominantly desert culture and, you know, one that is the heir, or, you know, the child of the most maritime culture in the history of the world. I say culture when I mean other words, but the war itself was kind of boring. We pushed this shit in, and I think like the only like that we get that line, you know, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. Like, that's like the one battle where there's any kind of contest. I think the only ship we actually lost.
Well, it's because it's the first battle wherein the American flag is raised on foreign soil.
Right, yeah. But I think the only frigate that we lost in the only one of these 6 frigates, it may not even been one of those 6. The only like ship we really lost was this one that we
burned ourselves.
Yeah, we steered it into the ground. We steered it into the shore, and then the Muslims they capture it, and they say, and then we sent a party ashore at night and burned it to the ground.
Like, and so, that's yeah. the USS Philadelphia.
Yeah, it's not much of a war, and like all strategic objectives were met relatively quickly. You know, it's like one of these things where the big deal is that it happened at all. You know,
and again, so like he's skirting around the little spicy bits of it. I'm just going to say it. You're going to have sort of a racial civilization, a clash of civilizations play out here, to a point where Pope Pius VII says the United States, even though in their infancy, has done more to humble the anti-Christian barbarians, the African coasts, than all of the European states had done. Throwing that one out there for fun tidbits later in the discussion.
Which pope was that?
Pope Pius VII.
That's incredibly based. I was not expecting to have nice things to say about a pope at the beginning of this stream, but life's full of small surprises. Yeah.
That's up there with Pope Leo the 13th, I think, who was the pope that blessed Ben-Hur: A Tale of the Christ as one of the best pieces of fiction written from a Christian perspective, which again was written by an American soldier, but that's a story for another day. I love that movie. But yeah, so this is where, of course, you get, and again, we've gone through all of this because the war really is relative. I mean, it's a prosecuted war of about 4 years and some change. But we do get the treaty that we get out of this, which is the Treaty of Tripoli in 1805. This is not to be confused with the Treaty of Tripoli that we signed with Algiers in 1796, which actually helped kick this stuff off because we started giving money to one bey or bashaw over the other. So out of this, it was negotiated by a man named Tobias Lear, who was he's actually got a long political history himself, but he was a secretary to President George Washington, and then, but he also was a ardent Jeffersonian Republican and was one of the few people that had sided with Jefferson in the midst of his own political battles. And so, he had helped sign it. It was signed on June 4th, 1805, and during what we would call the First Barbary War. There's some stuff that happens later, like 1815, but the majority of it happens in this one small conflict. And so the terms are rather straightforward. The United States agrees to abandon Derna, the provincial capital city of Libya, during the conflict. We won't supply any mercenaries that we had gone with us, which is its own fun story. The mercenary allies that the United States has is actually the brother of Pasha Yusuf Karamalni, the guy that had wanted to go to war with us in the first place, who had claimed to be the actual heir and the legitimate ruler of Tripoli. So again, it kind of echoes our American history with respect to its interest and intrigue of Middle Eastern and Islamic affairs, where we pitch one brother against the other. And of course, the Pasha would release his brother's children and wife, whom he was holding hostage. Prisoners were exchanged, including most of the crew of the USS Philadelphia. And of course, a $60,000 payment to the U.S. by the U.S. to Tripoli, due to the differences in numbers of prisoners exchanged. But of course, this treaty would be broken later in 1815. It's also known as the U.S.-Algerian War, but that does not last nearly as long, in part because it happens only for a few days over in June, and the U.S. quickly scuttles that shit very quickly.
You talking about the Second Barbary War?
Yeah, the one with Commodore Stephen Decatur just ending it very quickly by, capturing 500 men, killing 50, and sinking a shit ton of ships.
Yeah, I mean, with that one, there's no chaos in Europe to take advantage of at this point either. So Napoleon's out of the way, total Anglo victory yet again. But yeah, this whole thing does happen again. We get this treaty out of the first one, and it lasts about a year. It
lasts for about a decade,
right?
Not a year.
But that's about it. It goes about as well. And this is one of these fascinating things again, because the style of politics is changing. This is another one of these things that's sort of interesting. So like the United States envisions itself making, treaties with, political entities. Okay. And sometimes these political entities, they have not all been brought up to speed with like contemporary European statecraft. So there's no continuity. There's not only is there no continuity of government between, changes in officials, there's no continuity of diplomacy either between these, highly personal regimes that are still, floating around in, Africa and in the, Eastern Mediterranean, and these essentially satrapy governments. And you can go to my blog. I wrote about one that was going on in, I don't even know where, Afghanistan or something like that. This fascinating space whenever you have like what we would think of as fully modern. They're not really nation states yet. Jürgen Osterhammel, God, he wrote a 1,200 page book about how this isn't quite a nation state yet. And I'm gonna bow to Jürgen Osterhammel's incredible autism on that particular issue and say this is not quite, the United States at this point. The United States and Russia are probably closer to being modern nation states at this point in time than Britain and France are, but they're, neither of them are, none of them are quite there, but they're, these are much closer to modern nation states that we think of in like these abstract entities that represent a people and they have continuity. And they're dealing with, they're making, diplomatic, they're dealing diplomatically with these highly personal governments that we, sort of associate with like much more ancient styles of diplomacy. And this is that era that, like I said, Reinhard Koselleck called the Sattelzeit, or the saddle time, which is the transition between, the fully medieval political economy, fully medieval style political economy, and then a fully modern. Koselleck puts this end of this Sattelzeit period almost. This is in his reading of it. This is very near the end of it. So around 1832, I think, is what was the last of the revolutions in the Atlantic world, and from there on, Koselleck will tell you that from 1842 on, we're dealing with explicitly nation state politics. And then Osterham, he wrote this incredible book called Transformation of the World, A Global History in the 19th Century. He comes along, he pushes it back to World War One. But that was a lot. There's a lot that was totally off subject.
Well, it happens when I think you and I get paired together.
It happens.
It's a common recurrence. So yeah, the other fun thing though is that the fun bit about William Eaton and the small detachment of Marines on Derna is that it's like, I think it's like 10 Marines and like 500 mix of Arabs and Greeks fighting with them. So yeah, I find that funny.
Imagine the smell.
Yeah, so 500 Arabs and Greeks that I'm sure do not get along, but are okay if it means that we can replace one pasha with his brother who claims to be the rightful heir of the throne. And this, of course, has the backing of Thomas Jefferson to say, yeah, well, I have the permission of the president to go do this, and why not?
Let's get another Jefferson related bit. He was once one of the greatest personal sort of like conundrums he faced as president. It's just one of the year, whenever, like 1 year for his birthday, one of these Muslim satraps offered him a personal gift of a thoroughbred horse it was like, and people know I've got a thing for horse racing. I love horse racing, but I don't love horse racing as much as Thomas Jefferson loved horse racing. This was like one of his things, and he had this incredible like debate with himself about whether or not he could accept this, like, and at the time, horse genetics are that's a valuable commodity on the order, kind of like on the order of, like, I don't know what you would think of as like a very high value, low volume commodity that exists in the world today. But the genes that exist within these Arabian horses, they can become very profitable for you if you're able to get one of these reproductively intact Arabian horses into the Western Hemisphere and start breeding it with the other local stock, because these horses are very fast, and they're and the gene pool of race horses in the Western world is incredibly small, and that is, so anything that could make these race horses that were being used in these in these Anglo-American races, anything that could make the horses less inbred was considered an incredibly valuable contribution. But Jefferson eventually came to the conclusion that he was not able to take this gift, and I can't remember what happened to the horse, but it was just Jefferson's biggest personal conundrum was whether or not he could take this racehorse from the Bay of Tripolitania or something like that.
Unfathomably based.
Like as someone Paul said, "Oh, well, while Sandbatch is a horse race realist, I don't know about that.
Well, yeah, it's the first time. Yes, bourgeois beatnik. That is what we covered. Also, Presley O'Bannon. What a I mean, what a fundamentally like American name from like Scotch Irish descent. Born in 1776, mind you. And so yeah, he has his like Eton leads like 10 men with like 500 Greeks and Arabs to raise the American flag over. But so that really does bring us towards a lot. I think the majority of what we wanted to talk about with respect to this war, like a lot of American history, and how when we talk about statecraft, you really cannot separate foreign policy from the domestic. And this is where you begin to see the earliest forms of words like ideology, balance of power, and then thinking collectively when it comes to the full costs and measures of protection and honor with respects to American interests. So those are things that I think are very important for us to consider. That even today in 2023, almost 200 years since this conflict had taken place, um, there's still a deeply vested civilizational interest in the area. There's still this debate about congressional authority versus executive authority in the conduct of statecraft, especially when it regards to war-making institutions. This is only accelerated with respects to technology and nuclear weapons from the Cold War onward, but it still is in place today. And that anytime that we really get concerned about a war, you will always see politics take its role in respects to taxation and who wants to bear the burden. And we still do that to this day. And yes, the Philadelphia was burned by a young Lieutenant Decatur. See, when I hear Decatur, I think of Decatur, the city, and I'm sure they're named after the young Lieutenant Stephen Decatur, who comes from a long lineage of Navy men. And so, yeah. And 200 years later, Hillary Clinton blew up Libya and made it a slave-owning territory again. Well, if we have the third Barbary War, so be it. Well, I'm sure we'll do it again.
Based Hillary.
Oh, Lord Almighty. Yeah, we must bear our
things that have never been said on Prude Stream before and never will be again.
They say Dark Brandon and things like that, but honest to God, if Hillary Clinton had managed to think about fortifying an election, then she would be doing dark Hillary memes or based Hillary memes.
We would probably have like pantsuit versions of the frog meme. Oh my God.
Imagine.
I'm sure that exists.
I'm sure they does, because didn't everyone also during the 2016 election do the "It's Dat Boy" thing? Everyone from Gary Johnson to Hillary Clinton campaign.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, what a weird family, the Clintons. Yeah, I mean, there's no relation, of course, to George Clinton, the governor of New York and adamant anti-federalist, but perhaps there is somewhere in the deep annals of 23andMe. But the Clinton bloodline is not something I want to question or debate, because I like living. So we're going to just let them do their thing. Apu and Amumu Clinton style. Yeah, there'd be a lot of like Apu Stayas with pantsuits on. The answer to the question was answered in the 1800s. Can an executive wage war without Congress? And it's always been yes. And that is true. That's one of the main takeaways from today's discussion. But before we get to announcements, Frog of the Week, and some other fun stuff, I'm going to put Sandbatch behind the studio for about 70 seconds. We are having a lovely sponsor for today's stream, and then we will bring him right back, and we will get towards the rest of our lovely discussions with you and answering some super chats that were from Entropy and by lovely and kind, generous donors from yourself. So Sandbatch, go ahead and use the restroom, get your coffee or whatever. You will be back in about 70 seconds. But with that being said, today's lovely stream has been sponsored by the wonderful people over at the app called CommonPlace. I wanted to tell you about this because it's a great reading app that I've enjoyed using and testing out. It's a social media app for readers to connect and discuss all things literature. It's a great place to simplify your process of saving quotes. You can just use your phone and easily capture the excerpts and add your own annotations effortlessly. You don't need to take a pen and paper anymore. You don't need to access a digital library or use Kindle Notes. You can just do it yourself right off your phone. You can follow people and see their own quotes and annotations. You can give them a like. You can follow their own comment section to discuss this. And it's modeled after, of course, Twitter, Reddit, other forms of social media for you to talk about your books, schedule book clubs, and share your thoughts on an author's background. Possibilities are endless. They've got groups ranging from Stoicism to Catholicism, so anything that you might be interested in, they've got it. I've also got my own little digital library on there, so you can go follow my discussions on there for discussions over Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind. I'll be posting all of my notes up there shortly, alongside some of the other books I've been reading, which includes the next book I'm going to be reviewing on stream, actually, which is The End of the World is Just Beginning by Peter Zeihan. So be sure to check out the wonderful links down below in the description. They will also be in the pinned comment. These guys are doing really good work, and I would rather definitely have the endorsement and sponsor with you guys people that want to put something together that is productive, creative, and entrepreneurial, rather than the 9 or 10 emails I keep getting from the Chinese time and time again saying I should sponsor an exercise bike. But sign up with CommonPlace today, and you can take a look at the Prudentialist book club that's there on screen and enjoy something with literature. And with that, we'll bring Sandbatch back on. But again, thank you to the people over at CommonPlace.
Does Logo know you stole his profile picture?
Logo Dadless doesn't exist in my book, so no. Also, that's like the default profile picture, actually, when you sign up with CommonPlace. It's been changed now to the lovely frog that I have here. But
it actually looks like a really cool app. I'm probably have to download it.
Oh, well, they would love that.
I've been successfully marketed to.
Amen, brother. Amen. Are the Chinese calling me fat? No, they just want to find out where I live so they can specifically mail me a some faulty Chinese package so I can end up on Live Leak on Telegram. And I don't want that. So instead, we're going to be reviewing and having great apps like CommonPlace for you all to sign up. You can look at the links down below in the description. These guys are still developing in places like that. So anytime that you run into a problem or things like that, they want your feedback. These guys are two really great guys out of the University of Michigan that found me through Orrin McIntyre. I like their product. And for once, I'm happy to say that I'm sponsoring somebody who is, they're entrepreneurs. They want to create something for you guys. So by all means, let's enjoy. So with that, I'm going to go share my screen, and we're going to get on with our lovely bits of the, this is, yeah, okay, I have the right announcements and things like that today. So let me go make sure. Yep, okay, cool. So we'll share screen, and we'll get right to it. And slideshow. So yeah, by all means, sign up with CommonPlace. There's no extra, cost or anything. It's free to sign up with. You can find me on there. There's a lot of great books that are being reviewed, not just by, people covering philosophy, but also great literature as well. I'm happy to announce, of course, that I will be speaking at this year's U.S. Sealings event down in the Nashville Convention. So tickets are still on sale. You can go over to Sildings.com and sign up with them, and be sure to get your tickets. Myself, the distributist, actually, it'll be Mr. Stephen Carson, Radical Liberation, and Orrin McIntyre will be there. So if you'd like to see some of us in person, hear about the needs for what kind of foundations do we need to base the future on, how do we look ahead, what sort of things do we need to build off of, that's what we'll be discussing. Later this week, I'll be posting the second half to my commentary on Joseph Soberin's Notes for the Reactionary of Tomorrow. And then Patrons Book Club, we finally finished Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, both parts. So there'll be 2 videos that will be up on YouTube's channel membership, Substack, and Subscribestar later tonight. I will be on Conscious Caracol's channel on the 13th of this coming month. I'll be on there with Geo. He wants to sort of talk about how the internet shapes our culture and our discourse. And so who better to have on than Geo and myself, who are the hosts of the Digital Archipelago, which will be...
There's one person missing. There's one person missing.
Well, you can send for her later. And so... that'll be happening on the 13th. A new Real Talk video drops this coming Wednesday on the 31st. And then I'm currently working on a new book review. I am reviewing Marty Phillips's new book, Millennium. So patrons will see that early, and then I will be submitting that review to IM1776 when I'm done. If you want to check out the book, by all means, go over to Antelope Hills Publishing, and you can go check out Marty Phillips's new book, Millennium. So that's what I'll be reviewing. Until then, on to Frog of the Week, ladies and gentlemen. And then this is where Sandbactch gets to endure frog fandom. So those new to the channel, we always end, no matter what we're talking about, no matter how dour, how dry, how awful the world may seem, we always end things with the lovely frog of the week. And just remember, all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. And I thought how important and how relatable that we'd be talking about the Barbary pirates and the Barbary War, than to have a frog from the North African part of the world. So we're talking about the Berber toad as this week's frog of the week, found throughout northern Africa and southern Spain. You can find these guys usually in dry cork oak forests, as well as watery marshes and shrublands. They tend to find themselves burrowing under rocks or digging into tunnels during the daytime to be hidden from predators, as most amphibians are also nocturnal in nature. The females lay about 5 to 10,000 eggs during mating season, which is usually in very early spring. That way they're not drying up in the still waters in respects to the summertime, not under any other major ecological threats, and they are still a relatively new frog species by reclassification that were used to be under the Bufo genus, but that was moved and recategorized in 2009. So technically a new frog in that respects. So that's this week's Frog of the Week. And with that, I just wanted to catch up with super chats and thank you all for being here. I do want to thank our top tier patrons of Fearless Leader, Preservatism, Raging Mandrill, Focron, User 4A, 5B, 5D, B5, Consumer, Cowering Bugman, Hunger, Winston Fujimori, Voluble Ox, and Flavanius. Your ongoing support for $20 or more a month on Subscribestar makes the world go round. And it's very something that I'm incredibly thankful for. I get to work part-time because you guys, it's full-time, but it's flexible hours to let me do what I do here, and your support makes that possible. So I'm very thankful for that. And with that, Sandbatch and I will happily answer your super chats and take a look at a few questions that we may have missed during the ongoing 2-hour discussion that we've had so far. But I think the first one was on entropy. Which comes from Jacob, also known as D. Bush Shorts Malfunction. He sends $3. So Sandbatch can be called a goober on entropy now. Very nice. Well, that's what the entropy chats are for, in case you wanted to test your limits there. But goober is always a fun one to
Wait, people are calling me goobers in a forum I can't see?
Yeah, the entropy super chats, they were calling you a goober. He paid $3 to call you a goober.
No, that's all. It's pretty funny.
Yeah, I thought so too. But we missed. I usually address the really big ones. But Blitz Turtle for $50 US. I'm incredibly thankful for your donation there. Thank you. He says the ship in Master and Commander is a frigate, the HMS Surprise. Her rival, the Archon, is based on the heavier frigates like the Constitution or Five Friends. Her oak sides and more guns mentioned in the movie, as is being built in the US.
Yeah, I kind of had a feeling that the ship, at least because I knew that the HMS Surprise, it was like part of the story is that it is significantly smaller than the Archon. I had a feeling that the Surprise was probably a frigate, because it would have been, the role that it plays. The frigate is going to be the ship that's operating off Patagonia or somewhere like that. It's not like it has a role in the the sort of fighting column, but it's not a ship of the line like some of these much larger ships are. Like when you see a ship of the line, we're talking very large structure, and frigates are considerably smaller. I feel like there was something about this one. Oh yeah, which is like which is, I don't know if everybody, I feel like most people probably know this trivia, but in the book Master and Commander, as opposed to the movie, it's one of those sleight of hands that was done between the book and the movie, is that in the book the opposition, the bad guys they're actually Americans. They changed it to the French in a movie. In the movie they're like, we can't do that, we got to sell this movie in America. But in the book the bad guys are Americans.
Yeah. Things that I don't know, anti-French sleight of hand kind of works for me in that respect. With Templar for $10 US says the entire immigration crisis in the EU is because of Hillary Clinton. Don't forget it, that Hillary Clinton gave Europe Canadian health care. It's also exacerbated by all the shit that we pulled in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Not all. Well, how much of that we can say is Hillary Clinton's doing is, I'm fine putting a lot of blame on her, but it's not solely her fault. And that's the only slight defense I'll give to it, yes. But America's foreign intervention isn't into that area.
Did you watch that? There was a video with her and Condoleezza Rice that came. It was the weirdest thing I've ever seen. Jon Stewart interviewing Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton. And I mean, like, yeah, the Daily Show.
Because Hillary's on a podcast tour, and so she's talked to Condoleezza Rice before. I don't know if it's the same one. I didn't see the one with Jon Stewart, but I wouldn't be surprised that this disgusting blob of people. I'm trying to be nice here. Yeah, but okay. I know I didn't see it.
It was fascinating because it's like remarkable how honest they were. You know, and of course, it's like, 20 years after the fact, the statute of limitations is up. But and one of the things is like if you're like into uniparty stuff, it was fascinating to watch Hillary because they're referring to their time as Secretary of State. It does include Hillary Clinton giving her own play-by-play about her own play-by-play with respect to the Libya stuff, which actually was interesting in its own right, just because of how actually honest she was, or at least seemed to be honest. You can never tell with her. And the other thing that's sort of interesting is how congruent she was with Condoleezza Rice. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when, I'm old enough to remember when we were presented Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton as like, one of them is the Sith Lord and the other one is like Girl Yoda. And it turns out.
Yeah, I remember that because my dad said he would have voted for her.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But it just turns out there was almost no space between them. It's difficult to figure out what they actually disagreed on. I wish I could find that video. I mean, I probably could find it.
Spoiler alert, they don't disagree on much.
Yeah.
And then last but not least is from our good friend Paul Moosefoot for $9.99 US. He says, "Have a nice Memorial Day, folks. Yes, remember the men and the slaves that were freed from the Barbary Wars, and that sometimes it's okay to engage in conduct that, destroys heathens." But yes, it is the Memorial Day weekend, so I hope that for those of you who are there, do keep in mind about conflicts past and present. So with that being said, I'm going to double check entropy here. All right, looks like we're good. Is there anything, Mr. Sandbatch, that you would like people to know about?
Oh, yeah, got an extra one today, actually. Of course, normally I have my blog, Esoterica Americano, that you can go see. You could go follow the link from my Twitter, which you should also follow, but I'm getting to the point I probably need to go find another pasture to milk for Twitter followers because I've probably got most of y'all at this point. You go check whether there's a link, my link, to my Substack.com, which apparently it's been long enough since I published one that I'm not sure if Substack's still being suppressed, but I have a feeling it probably is. We'll get some new ones out relatively soon. But then I also wanted to point out that I am contributing fiction, though one could argue that everything I say is fiction in at least one sense. I'm contributing to the revival of an old literary magazine that was published out of New Orleans called The Double Dealer. I am by no means the star of this show. However, we've got work coming up from J.L. Mackey. If y'all seen his if y'all read his Cowboy Church little novella, it's one of the best fictional treatments that's come out of this side of America. It's I hesitate to actually say out of this side of anything because it's actually just a good book. He's just a great writer. T.R. Hudson is the editor. And you can go if you want to check the Double Dealer out. You go follow him. Probably search it at the top of the Twitter search bar. I like to tell people how to go find stuff. I'm like, just Google it, man. But y'all know how to find stuff on your own.
So go follow the Double Dealer magazine. I'm excited with the cavalcade people and characters that are behind it to see the revival of a literary magazine.
Cavalcade.
It's a cavalcade of critters over there with you guys.
Double Dealer is actually a real interesting literary magazine. It was published out in New Orleans, which of course is my interest in it, all things South. But it was in the middle part of the 20th century. I talk about this a lot. How the right, what we could typically think of as the aesthetic right, was ascendant in the dominant world culture, and Double Dealer magazine was one of the ones that was. They weren't just real big in terms of circulation, but they were real big in terms of who published with them. So this is a magazine out of New Orleans. Ezra Pound published with them. The Vortices, Wyndham Lewis published with them. They published William Faulkner. They published Just a lot of the who's of the 20th century, and then it lapsed for like 80 years or whatever, and we're trying to reestablish it as a as a vehicle for print fiction. There's not going to be not any think pieces, no reviews or anything like that. It's explicitly artistic, explicitly fiction, which I think is it's a thing that a lot of times we don't really think about that. We're always trying to look for ways to staple the aesthetics to the politics, or staple the politics to the aesthetics, and just to have this is just stories. It's like we're not concerned about politics at all. Don't care if the story's right wing or not. It's like as long as it's good, just publish good stories, and that's what we're trying to do.
Well, I'm certainly looking forward to it in that respect. So yes, all Mr. Sandbatch's links are down below. His Telegram, We Are So Back, Esoterica Americana, the Substack, as well as his Twitter account at Sandbatch. So be sure to follow him there for more interesting takes on American history, and history in general, as well as the South and literature. So by all means, do so. As for you all, I will see you all this Wednesday with the premiere of a new video. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Sunday and Memorial Day weekend. Before we do go, we include our streams with you. I will be pulling out my Bible here and then going to work here. So give me one second here. So continuing on, we'll be reading from Proverbs 13. So a wise son heareth his father's instruction, but a scorner heareth not rebuke. A man shall eat good by the fruit of his mouth, but the soul of the transgressors shall eat violence. He that keepeth his mouth keepeth his life, but he that open wide his lips shall have destruction. The soul of the sluggard desireth, and hath nothing, but the soul of the diligent shall be made fat. A righteous man hateth lying, but a wicked man is loathsome and cometh to shame. Righteousness keepeth him that is upright in the way, but wickedness overthroweth the sinner. There is that maketh himself rich, ye have nothing, and there is that maketh himself poor, yet have many riches. The ransom of a man's life are his riches, but the poor heareth not rebuke. The light of the righteous rejoiceth, but the lamp of the wicked shall be put out. Only by pride comes contention, but those that are well advised have all the wisdom in the world. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will bid you all a good afternoon, a good evening, a good morning, wherever you are, and I will see you all in the next episode this coming Saturday, and I'll see you at the premiere of the next video this Wednesday. Take care, and God bless.